Hi, this is Sloof at the VMworld 2014. I'm at the bookstore and I'm joined by Wahl and Pantol. How are you doing, guys?
Doing great. Fantastic.
Outstanding. How about yourself?
Okay, these guys launched a real cool book. It's called Networking for vSphere Administrators, for VMware administrators. And networking is quite important for a vSphere environment. Do you agree?
Well, yeah. I mean, I want the book to sell, so
Okay.
I think it's pretty important. But
So it's touching many components within vSphere. It's used by vMotion, it's used by fault tolerance. Networking is also used in storage, and the regular virtual machine traffic is also going through networking. So you have to right size it and everything. What are the main takeaways when people are buying this book?
ultimately, everything talks to the network. It has to at some point. So we broke up into physical networking for the first third of the book, talking about everything you need to build the underlay, the physical switching, how that all works, and give you kind of a dictionary so that if you're a server virtualization person, you can talk to your network folks. And then we go into all the virtual components, kind of the flip-flop. We talk about distributed switching and standard switching and all the various port groups and all the nuts and bolts that you need to build your virtual network. And then we talk about the design around that. So we take your physical and your virtual, and we actually give examples around iSCSI and NFS and 10 gig and all that stuff necessary to actually build out the network.
It's good that you say iSCSI, because I was reading a tweet and I misunderstood it for years, but if you are going to do multipathing on iSCSI and you add 2 physical network cards to 1 switch, you are allowed to use the IP address in the same subnet. But what I saw is that if you are using different switches, then you are not allowed to use the same subnet. Is that true?
I've never done 2 switches, honestly, for iSCSI. It just doesn't, I don't see the point. So I think we've typically just done 1 subnet on 1 switch, and the kernel binding builds the fabric. So I don't really know why you would necessarily do the 2 switches to begin with. I'd have to go deeper on that, I suppose. But I know for sure you can use 1 subnet on 1 switch. The kernel binding handles all the actual fabric and the paths to the iSCSI target, and that works just fine.
So what you're saying is that you're not allowed to use network failover, but the whole multipathing of iSCSI itself can do the pathing, and you don't do it twice.
Yeah, just make it simple, right? You're building, it's almost like a fiber channel network where you have specific paths from your host to storage, right? And so you're doing very similar thing, block storage on iSCSI, you're building those paths, the connection from the VM kernel port to the initiator on the VM kernel port to the target on the storage. You're building that relationship, they talk to one another one-to-one, and you're ready to rock and roll.
Okay, that's cool. So another question I sometimes get is, a virtual switch is a piece of software. If I'm doing about 1 gigabyte of data, how does it compare to the number of CPU cycles that are needed in that switch? So how does it work in the kernel? Do you actually, when you're designing a host, are you accounting for a lot of network traffic?
Yeah, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite catch it all.
So what I'm saying is, if you want to move like 1 gigabyte,
Sure.
are you making sure that you have enough CPU cycles to actually put it through the virtual switch?
It's interesting that you phrase it that way. Are you making sure? No. It's really not something I take into account. The network overhead on the CPU when sizing cluster nodes. Never really thought about it. I've never really needed to. Maybe Chris can elaborate.
Yeah, what's your angle on it?
Yeah, there's so much CPU available already on most hosts. Unless you had some really specific workload that was just going to clobber the CPU on the host, it's so minor that I think even with a full 10 gig core rocking away, it may be 1 core that it might use at max. It's just so trivial that it doesn't really go into the design very much.
Okay. So another thing about binding. We have static binding, we have dynamic binding. There's also ephemeral binding, and we have static with when it runs full, it automatically adds more ports to the switch. So when do you use ephemeral binding? I never saw the real great thing about ephemeral binding.
Well, the answer now would be you really don't. So dynamic binding was deprecated, it's gone. Pretty much everything defaults to static binding, and VMware wants you to use static binding at all times. Ephemeral had some use case with link clones where it could accidentally use the port ID repetitiously when a link clone would be peeled off the master. And there was also some issues where if vCenter couldn't start up because there was no port assigned into it, the ephemeral might get around that. But for the most part, VMware's taking care of all that. If you're running a modern version of vSphere, you can pretty much use static binding with elastic port expansion right off the gate, and you're pretty much good to go.
Okay, pretty cool, pretty cool. Guys, many thanks for the interview. I definitely would recommend to buy this book. It's called Networking for VMware Administrators. It's from VMware Press, and it contains a lot of valuable information. Last word?
Just want to tell everyone, if they do purchase the book, that I'm donating all the profits to Alzheimer's Association, so we really appreciate the support, and hopefully it's fun and interesting, and there's some tech good that, I don't know, you'll enjoy. It's something you can actually enjoy reading. It's fun.
Yeah, I mean, for all the technical content that's in there, we try to make it as light of a read as possible. You can sit there and read it and not fall asleep. So enjoy.
Okay, guys,
Great.
many thanks.